Hey, everybody, two quick announcements before we start. Number one is I want to thank Corey Sherman for becoming a new podcast supporter. If you want to learn more about all the different options for supporting the podcast, just go to mountainandprairie.com/support. And second, you'll notice this in probably about 10 seconds, but I have really shortened up the intro to the podcast. After 170 episodes, I don't think we need the full explanation every time. So I'm just saying, this is the Mountain Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. Hopefully that'll save you a little bit of time. You won't have to fast forward through that thing. I think I recorded it in maybe the 5th episode I ever did. I've been using the same one over and over, and I think that's a waste of everybody's time. So I'm shortening it up. Just wanted to let you know. Thanks so much for your support. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Chris Dombrowski. Chris is a Missoula-based writer, poet, teacher, and fishing guide. And he's also the author of the excellent new book, The River You Touch, Making a Life on Moving Water. If you're a longtime Mountain and Prairie listener, you probably remember Chris's first appearance on the podcast, in which we discussed his first book, Body of Water, and his poetry collection, Ragged Anthem. Since that first conversation, Chris has become a great friend, sounding board, and supporter, and his generous spirit and creative commitment continue to be a huge source of inspiration for everything I'm trying to do here at Mountain and Prairie. Like me, Chris is not originally from the West, but since moving here, he's built a meaningful, purpose-driven life that's deeply connected to the region's rugged land and powerful rivers. Whether guiding fishing clients on the Big Hole, foraging food with his family, or hunting birds with his dog Zeke, the West wild places are a cornerstone of Chris's life, professionally, personally, and spiritually. His new book, The River You Touch, offers rich insights into his journey from his home state of Michigan to his now home of Montana, as well as his personal evolution as a husband, father, friend, and community member. Beautifully written, surprisingly vulnerable, and extremely inspiring, The River You Touch is one of the best books I've read this year. Chris and I connected virtually and had a fun conversation about the book, fatherhood, adventure, writing, and much more. We started by discussing how The River You Touch came to be, which has an interesting connection to our first podcast conversation. We talk about his process of combining poetic prose with nonfiction narrative, as well as his desire to explore ideas around masculinity and vulnerability. We talk a lot about Jim Harrison, their friendship, Harrison's genius, and his otherworldly work ethic. We talk about family, the blessing of having strong and tough wives, advice for aspiring writers, and plenty of good book recommendations. Hope you enjoy. All right, Mr. Dombrowski, I've reached out to you. I mean, it very well could have been 4 or 5 years ago now via Mr. Zuckerberg's social media platform and just like randomly ask you to come on my podcast. And you were nice enough to do that for your first book. And then you've just been so nice to me over the years for no reason. And you've been so generous with both your time and your resources and with your introductions. And so it's really awesome to be sitting here talking about your new book. And so I was wondering, just to start out, could you just talk about how you decided to write this book? Because I would imagine a guy like you, you're always thinking, you're always reading, you've always got a million ideas. And so how did you kind of zone in on the idea that became The River You Touch?
Great question, Ed. Thank you for having me back, man. I feel like I'm always back with you. We're in conversation so often, so it doesn't feel like it's been 5 years since I was on the show, but you're right, it's been a while. But strangely enough, I mean, you and I actually talked about this book when I was on talking about Body of Water. I'd been working on it for a few years at that point, and I was in the, I guess you could call it the drafting process. And I'll be darned if that conversation that we had didn't somehow kind of inspire me to, well, it helped me articulate what was at the core of the book, which was, you know, that great question, how then do we live, right? And so, you know, I originally this book was originally contracted as a collection of essays, some of which I had already written, some of which were just, essays in concept. And a number of those had as kind of a theme, the theme of wonder, in particular, that sense of wonder that children seem so adept at retaining, and yet it seems so elusive to us, the more we age. And so I think the original title was The Nature of Wonder. And during the writing process, I kind of a couple things happened. Stop me if I'm not answering your question here, but I think I'm going to get to it.
No, I love it. I love it.
So a couple things happened. One, I fell out of love with the essay and into love with long form nonfiction, partly because I had begun Body of Water as a collection of essays, and it evolved into a long form book. And I love that period of kind of magical thinking that occurs over the course of, like, once you've been working on a book for a while, when things start to cohere in ways that you hadn't envisioned. When that happens with long form, it's just a glorious feeling. So I fell in love with that, not so much out of love with the essay, but in love with that feeling of long form. And so I had begun kind of to lay out these essays, the pre-existing ones, chronologically. And then I began to kind of write a narrative through them. And I used my journals from, 15 years of guiding and being a young parent to kind of help me navigate those dark spaces between, the existing works. And what inspired me, I guess, as I say in the preface, I began this book as a love song to the rivers that I've guided on for the past 25 years. But as my buddy Jeffrey Foucault reminded me, every love song succeeds on an element of doubt. And at that point in the process of drafting the book, I was besieged with plenty of doubts, as were many of us. It was kind of in the middle of the pandemic, and in the middle of many moments of mania in the history of America. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
And so I began the book as kind of a love song to rivers and a chronicle of wonder, that faculty of wonder that I think is going to save us from ourselves, But I didn't. That faculty of wonder was something that I had kind of lost, despite the very feral life that I live guiding, and it was our children that really resurrected that in me. And so the narrative traces that period of I'll just resurrection is a freighted term, but I like it in this sense because it really was a faculty that was kind of had vanished in me or was dead in me. And so, like, retracing our steps with our children as we kind of navigated wild places together really started to rekindle and revivify that in me. And that was the original impulse, I guess, to writing the book. That was your question, right?
Yeah. And so I love all that. And you and you're a little bit ahead of me as far as ages of kids, and you've got one more than I have, which is, I just can't understand how people do three kids. But, and I feel like you convey some of the chaos that comes with three kids so well in this book. But like when you kind of hit on this a second ago, but when you set out to write something like this and you kind of figure out what you're going to do, like, what is if there even is a goal, is there a goal to it? Like, is it you trying to figure this stuff out and writing is the way to do it? Or are you offering inspiration and instruction to people like me that are a little bit behind you, but who look to your experience and your ability to put all this stuff together in a way that's both inspiring and instructional so that I can do a better job at my parenting, which this book has already helped me do? Or is it just kind of like an artistic impulse and you're like, this is in me, I got to get it out? I mean, or am I way overthinking it beyond anything that you think about? Like, is there a goal to any of this?
Definitely not the latter. Definitely the former. I mean, for me, writing is an act of discovery. And if there isn't any discovery for the writer, I don't believe there's any discovery for the reader. And so primarily, the act of composition is the act of discovery. So I'm learning as much about all this as the reader is, as I'm going through this. And that's because I think I aspire to art, to make art, right? And art doesn't know the answers. Art asks the questions. And so I just kept asking that question over and over again. What's a meaningful, sustainable life look like at this point in our, in the Anthropocene or whatever we call it nowadays? And I kept asking myself that question, and I kept seeing the answers in our community, in this amazing Montana community, in our friends who are our hunter-gatherers, in our our conservationist friends, in our in the characters that sort of enact that authentic life. And so you ask a really good question. At no point do I ever want the work to seem didactic. Do I want the work to seem like I know the answers and I'll help you? Because that's just not that's not who I am. I mean, I think any wisdom that I have is only the result of the knowledge of all that I don't know. It's not the act of knowing something and passing it on to someone else. I mean, the other thing though, what I aspired to in the sentences, and this is oddly political, because I don't think we can convince anyone at this point in our American division of believing anything that they don't already believe, right? And yet, I do believe that the natural world, if the encounters are deep enough and have a density of experience, that encounters with the natural world can lead people to change their minds and their hearts, right? And so I wanted this prose to be an enactment of contact with the natural world. And that's why, that's where the title comes from, The River You Touch, because I believe that, I could sit in conversation with someone whose political views are in opposition to mine, like say regarding, let's just say water conservation in the West, right? I could sit at the table for 3 hours with them, trying to articulate myself, presenting good arguments, and they would probably still walk away with the same, political opinions that they have. But if I put them in the Upper Big Hole River for 2 hours, and show them where, like water conservation practices have helped retain the fluvial Arctic grayling population, and they're literally like holding a fish that they have caught in their hands, suddenly their defenses start to cave a little bit, right? And so, in many ways, I aspired anyway to create a prose experience that was as close to touching the natural world as possible.
Well, yeah. Well, that was, it's funny because like I'm looking at my list, and that was the next question I had on my list. Is I thought that you. And again, like this is me as an outsider, as a non-writer, just, as a fan, just so if I say anything that's completely wrong, correct me. But I feel like you come at the reader from every single angle. Like there's natural history in here. There's some adventure. There's just this poetic, a lot of it is like reading poetry to me. And I'm not an expert on poetry, but in general, when I read books, I've gotten to the point where I go really fast. Like I read extremely fast. And on this book, I caught myself, like my brain just kind of subconsciously saying like, slow down, enjoy this. It's like I'm normally just, it's like how I eat. I just eat like an animal. And this was like a really good meal. And my brain's like, hey, will you just calm down for a minute and enjoy this? You need to slow down. And I feel like you hit it, there's parenting things, there's conservation things, there's history, all these different aspects that pull the reader in. So it's almost like, well, if you're not interested in poetic writing, maybe you're interested in natural history. And I was wondering, how do you even begin to go about structuring something like this? Because the way I told you when I'd only read like 30 pages of it after you sent it to me, and it sent the pre-copy to me. I was like, it reads like a river, like it kind of winds around and it's going where it's going. You don't really know, but it's just how it should be. So how do you go about from just a technical, like McPhee structure, way of going, how do you structure something like this?
Well, you mentioned McPhee, and I have read that book of his, draft number 4, his craft.
Yeah, it's like an engineering manual.
Right. I know. And I can't say that I comprehend it fully, but I get it on some levels. Like, he's basically saying you have to have your own logic to narrative structure. And no one else necessarily has to know precisely what that is, but you have to know it. And so in many ways, the river metaphor that you bring up is really accurate. I don't feel like this is my story. I mean, there's a narrative first person I, and there are elements of memoir in this book throughout it, right? But I try to gather or to let the floodplain of the narrative gather as much outer material, tertiary material as possible. Particularly, like, I believe that this book is telling the story of the landscape,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the landscape is probably the main character, and our place in it is maybe the question that it asks, like, what is one's proper place at this point in history in the landscape, right? And so to do that, I had to give the landscape as much stage time as possible, which is easy for me because I wish I were a landscape painter. If I had any talent to paint like our son Luca does, he's a beautiful landscape painter. I would paint landscapes, but I can't. So I have to try to do it in words. So what I thought of, I often thought of this narrative as a river that openly received, feeder streams and springs and rills and whatever offerings the valley might provide, and instead of like saying, oh, the geological history is not part of this story, I just said, yeah, it is, and let's bring it in, instead of saying the history of, say, the Salish people and their relationship with horses wasn't part of the story. I said, no, let's bring it in. And so in that sense, like, I hope I'm not being too esoteric here, but the narrative itself gained momentum, and it carried my own personal story much farther than I would have been able to carry it had I just been writing about, quote, myself, right? And this is kind of the idea of aspiring anyway to get out of the small s self and into the big S self, which is, an awareness of our interconnectedness with everything. And so, I mean, I love that idea of multiplicity. It's a quality of art that Italo Calvino writes about in his 6 memos for the new millennium. And he says, like, basically, if art doesn't have multiplicity, it won't survive in the next millennium, because our world, I mean, just look at your Instagram feed, for goodness sake, right? I mean,
yeah.
Mine is fairly limited to, landscape painters, fish pictures, and like soccer highlights. But, most people's are a little more diversely oriented than that. But,
that sounds good to me. Yeah. I need to narrow mine down to that.
So yeah, that essentially was the narrative rules, I guess, that I tried to adhere to, which was one of acceptance. A river doesn't turn away any volume. It grabs any volume it can get, right? And in that sense, I think the work resulted in an expansiveness that surprised me, but it ultimately pleased me.
Yeah. Again, I'm not a writer, so I don't know how this will land with you, but a lot of the way you wrote a lot of this, it reminded me of the way that sometimes Bill Bryson will write these stories, and they go in these unexpected directions, and you just don't even know, you don't know where it's going, and then it comes right back, and it's so fun to read. But your work is so much more poetic than anything I've ever read of Bryson's. And it's one of those things where when I look at some writers, No disrespect or anything, but I'm like, if I bet I could do something similar to that if I tried hard enough, or, just like straight up history. I mean, it wouldn't be great, but I can kind of understand how they go about doing it. But when I'm reading this, I mean, from 10 pages in, I'm like, I don't understand how he does this. It's really it's really amazing to me. If you could bottle that up and sell that what you do, it'd be pretty amazing, man. So you mentioned about the, how your story is woven throughout, and how you're able to kind of offer more of that because of the landscape. And you do offer a lot about yourself and about your family and about, everything from mental health to, family history kind of stuff. And what was that like being so revealing about yourself? I remember when we spoke, when the book was going to come out, and you said, well, at this point, I'm just focused on the narrative and the structure, and it is what it is. But when you're writing those first words on the page about maybe some, things about how you go about thinking about things or how the inner workings of your brain, does that make you nervous at all?
No, but only because I don't give it a whole lot of forethought. I don't think about like when it'll actually be a book when I'm writing it. I just think I need to have I need to pay all allegiance to the sentence itself and to the truth and the music that it's creating, right? And so I don't think, I'm writing about myself here, this is revealing. It just doesn't dawn on me. I know that sounds naive, and part of that is because I do believe pretty intently on the difference between the narrative I, the first person I, and the guy who makes tea first thing in the morning and French toast for his daughter for breakfast. Like, they're just different. One is a construct, right? And the other is a human being. We want the construct to represent a human being, but it is a construct. So anyway, at least I believe in that enough. I believe in that notion enough to free myself into writing about things that are revealing or painful or embarrassing or whatnot. But I mean, part of that has to do with my belief in vulnerability as a necessary trait to being human. Like Jim Harrison said, vulnerability is a writer's best defense. Why naturally do I reject this?
Yeah.
And we do reject it as humans, right?
But, I definitely do. Holy shit. Yeah. Right. I mean, that's like, I think I've changed some on that thanks to talking to people like you on this podcast, but hell yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so part of it is coming to terms with that, like our fallibility, our vulnerability, and just saying like, whatever we've done, thought, said, whatever, I mean, it's out there in the universe. There's no hiding it, right? There's the illusion of hiding it. I'm not saying like, what did one of my friends say? He said, sometimes I felt like the narrative was getting a look into your sock drawer. And I wasn't sure if that was a little slight or a compliment or whatever, but I think that there were parts of this book that surprised me, that I found myself writing things that I didn't know I was going to write about, in particular, a depression that I had endured. And man, when I got to the end of it, I thought, I'm really glad I wrote that. There's something about naming and putting into words an experience that you have endured that allows you a certain passage through it that might not have been available to you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And then thinking about it from the reader's perspective, I think I know you're not doing this to try to teach a lot of people lessons, as we discussed earlier, but I think having somebody with the vulnerability like you have to put it out there and just say, this is how it's going, this is the truth. I think there are tons of other people who read that and they're like, oh, okay, well, that makes me feel better that I'm not the only one going through something like that. And I think talking to people like you and all these people I've had on the podcast about a million different subjects and this willingness to just put yourself out there, it really does make the world better, I think, because I can only speak for myself, but I know that talking to people like you about a wide variety of subjects when they have everything from like the creative process to getting down in the dumps to all that kind of stuff. Like it's just so nice to know that there are other people that are dealing with similar issues. And that's, I mean, this book across the board, I connected with so much of it, you know, especially like the parenting stuff that, okay, well, our house isn't the only one that's just pure insanity for 14 hours a day.
Yeah. It's funny. I have, you know, this book's been out for 5-6 weeks, you know, published on October 11th. And I've gotten a lot of wonderful notes and letters already so far from people. And many of those folks have written to tell me that, yeah, I experienced some things that you articulated for me in this book, you know, in very, very personal notes. And definitely I've had the sense that, yeah, I'm glad I wrote that, because if I hadn't, you know, these people wouldn't be making like an intense connection with the book. I was talking last night with my friend Taylor Brorby, who's a writer. You got to have him on. He wrote a book called Boys and Oil: Growing Up Gay in a Fractured Land, about his youth growing up gay in rural North Dakota. And he's an environmentalist now, so he's, you know, writes about a lot about the pipeline as well. But we were talking about a friend of ours who we were kind of worried about. Actually, I was driving back from Elk River Books in Livingston, where I'd given a reading, and I narrowly missed hitting an elk on the road. In fact, it was going right to left, crossing the road. And then it decided it needed to go back to the right. Oof, and it peeled off and went in front of me. And I'm telling you, I parted the breath, the steam that its breath had cast into the air with my car. I mean, and I was only going 50, you know, it was dark. But anyway, I thought I'll give my friend Taylor a call here and try to, he's I call him the burning bush. Like, he's just on fire with inspiration. And so we were chatting to keep me awake anyway. And we were just talking about a friend of ours who we were worried about, had some things going on, and we were worried about him getting through the winter. And we started talking about that passage in my book where the narrator is driving with his buddy Ralph. Do you remember this?
Yeah. I do remember that.
And they're kind of the narrator and Ralph are kind of bouncing back and forth these Jim Harrison lines. And Ralph says, "My year-old daughter's red robe hangs from the doorknob shouting, 'Stop, stop,' the madness, the mental torture that Harrison was going through at that time." Yet Letters to Yesenin was Jim's letters to Sergei Yesenin, who committed suicide at age 30, a Russian poet. And anyway, we got pretty deep, and we talked about how books sometimes know more about themselves than their authors do, you know. And I told Taylor, he said, you know, one of my favorite passages was that scene where after you're picking morels with Lily, you put her on your shoulders and you guys cross the stream together, you know.
Yeah.
And her legs kind of tighten around my neck, and I feel like their sweatiness and they're scraped by thorns or whatnot, you know. And it's at that period in the book that I've been, I guess you could say, delivered by a wonderful community from a dark place in my life, right? And we were talking about this notion that books sometimes know more than their authors. I wrote that chapter about picking morels off of some journals, some long existing journals that I'd had. And it never occurred to me when I wrote that image of her legs around my neck that it was the perfect anti-image to the noose that had killed Yesenin, you know?
Oh, wow.
So anyway, we just had this beautiful talk about how when a writer puts himself at the mercy of the current of the narrative, you know, that current will can take the writer to places he never envisioned, you know. So I can't even remember what got me off on that little side channel, but
no, I love that. I love that stuff. There's so many damn questions I want to ask you. So I feel like this book, I mean, like I said, it comes from a million different angles. But one thing I feel like is unique, and I think people think I read, like just constantly read a lot, but I don't feel like I'm all that very well read, like across a diverse spectrum. So I very well could be missing anything, but I've never read a book that comes from somebody that I can really identify with, who is connected to the land, loves adventure, loves the natural world, who kind of a parent, in a way, like a parenting book that expresses vulnerability, expresses all these doubts, but, talks about how parenting is the most important thing they've ever done. But it's not doesn't come off as like soft or overly emotional or anything. I mean, it's like the best version, masculinity gets a bad rap these days, but like the best version of masculinity and vulnerability with parenting and the outdoors. I mean, are there any other authors you know of who've written anything similar to what you've written here?
No,
'cause I don't.
No, man. And I think that was part of the allure to me, for a number of reasons. One, I mean, I've always was drawn to like the wave of fiction that was popular in the late 80s, early 90s. The Raymond Carvers, the Richard Fords, the Tobias Wolffs of the world were grouped into this category called the dirty realists. Like a lot of their books were very kind of, the settings were very domestic or whatever. And I thought to myself, like, their parenting is a wilderness. And so I wanted to try to render it, in as much detail as possible, as honestly as possible. And then once I started doing that, I did think to myself, well, this is an interesting twist on the Western, like here's the guy rowing the river for his living, but also like very closely observing, like, changing diapers or stealing a sip of breast milk for his rhubarb crisp in the morning, something like that, I didn't start out thinking like, oh, I'll write from this perspective. No one's done that. But once I started, I did think, oh, it was somewhat of a new vantage anyway. And I love what this one reviewer for Bomb Magazine said about the book. She said it torches the narrative of the single solitary dude, like conquering the mountain or killing the bear, whatever, because it immerses itself in the vulnerability of community, and
yes,
in so doing, it says basically like, okay, I can't do this on my own. What does this community have to offer that can see us through? And I love that about Missoula. I mean, you and I talked about it a few weeks ago when we were trying to get you up here for a live podcast. Like, this place is an astounding place. I mean, John Updike perhaps apocryphally called it the Paris of the 90s. And I mean, I know more people here who are making art and fantastic writing than per capita. I don't think there's anywhere like it in the world,
Oh, I agree. And I think we talked about this, but I just read a book called Mile Marker Zero about Key West in the 70s, and your pal Jim Harrison down there, and McGuane and Jimmy Buffett and Hunter S. Thompson. It was just this hot spot for creative people, and they all went off to do their own things. And I'm always wondering, like, where is that now? And there's a pretty good argument that something similar is happening in Missoula, because people always, if you look at my podcast list, like, it's abnormally heavy on Missoula people, and it's not like it's just by chance. And it's everybody from artists like you to Juanita, who's the county commissioner, who's just this unbelievably interesting, creative person who's applying that to public service and to conservation. And it's
sure. Yeah.
It's just a cool spot, man. I hopefully the real estate prices won't make it the new Key West, but I
don't see, they're not going anywhere. The prices aren't, but yeah, I mean, we're all here and we're all going to stick it out, right. I mean, the Chandra Browns of the world who started,
oh man, how great is she?
Flow Institute, and
just go to my list and like go to my podcast, and like out of the 170 episodes, like a third of them are Missoula people.
That's great. That's awesome. Yeah.
So speaking of that, I want to talk about Jim Harrison because he's featured in this book, and I didn't realize the extent of your friendship with him. I mean, I knew you knew him, but I didn't fully appreciate the role that he had played. And so then people can read the book to understand how that all came about. But here's a question I have just personally about Jim Harrison is I don't understand how he was able to go so hard with booze and cigarettes and that kind of thing and still have the discipline to write every day. Because when I think about him, and I didn't know him, and so I'm not trying to act like I knew him, but it's kind of there are these two extremes of this unbelievable discipline and work ethic to write every single day, but then also kind of a wild man side that while like McGuane and some of those guys calmed down after they left Key West, it seemed that he continued to be a bit of a wild man. And so how did he operate on those two far ends of the spectrum? It just blows my mind that somebody could do that. Because I mean, I had to quit drinking just because like you drink 2 beers and I'm depressed for 4 days after that. Like, I don't understand how anybody can function.
Yeah. He was you hear the cliche a lot, force of nature, but he really was a force of nature. And I mean, just in terms of sheer output, right?
Yes.
900 pages plus is his collected poetry. 30 some books is his collected prose. One of his generation's best poets, the best writer of novellas in the American half century, one of the best comedic writers, probably in terms of like, he doesn't sell as many books as say like maybe, I don't know, Jonathan Franzen or something like that. But the people who love Jim's work love it more than anyone else's work. Does that make sense?
Yes. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so he was an absolute force of nature. And he was also a real deal bona fide genius. Not like, oh, that guy's a genius. He invented the like purple haze fly that catches trout. No, I mean, Jim was a genius. He was a complete one of a kind, rigorous, severe, singular mind. He absolutely was a real genius. The Lois Welch, who is mentioned kind of in passing in the book, in that scene, one of the scenes where Harrison is at our house for dinner, the one where he tells the snow snake story to our son. Lois tells this story of having Jim to speak at a conference about writers in the natural world back in, I think, the mid-90s or something like that. And he kind of offhandedly made this remark about renaming the species of Western birds, because he thought it was kind of pathetic that every bird was named after Lewis or Clark,
Yeah.
And like people just wrote it off as kind of Jim's irreverent humor. But then someone in the audience asked him, like, so this project of yours, renaming the birds, like, what are some of the names? And he proceeded to rattle off like 15 names in a row, like the beige Dolorosa, or, all of these actual names. Like he clearly had just done this, and
yeah, he had already thought it out. Actually, it wasn't just mouthing off. He had gone through the whole thing.
And like Lois turned to, I forget who was next to her, and she said, he really is a genius, So he was, I mean, that was part of it. I mean, he ran the car down to empty on low oil for quite a long time, but he also was just a sheer genius. And he was driven, golly, man, even late. I mean, he died while writing a poem, he was at his desk. He had a heart attack. He was writing a poem on the Saturday before Easter. So I think, I asked him about his productivity once. I said, how do you manage to do it? Like, how do you keep writing poems when you're writing these novels, blah, blah, blah. And he said, the goose that lays the golden egg should not look at its ass. And that, which actually totally sounds like Jim. But then he pivoted. He was always pivoting. He said, I was freed into productivity by the utter lack of ambition.
But like, I don't get that though. Like, cause for me, when I'm cranking hard and what makes me go, I mean, this very well could sound bad, but it's ambition. Like, I want to get shit done. I want to do stuff. And so that's what drives me. And so what he's saying is that the complete lack of that, maybe I should just drop the ambition.
Well, I mean, artistically, like if your ambition is to produce as many poems as you can in your life, like that's a good ambition. But if your ambition is to produce a Pulitzer Prize winning volume of poetry, like that's probably a harmful ambition.
Process versus end goal. Right. I get that. Right. Yeah. I'm all about process.
Yeah, that's probably what he was, referring to in that sense. Like
that makes sense.
So it was like the opposite, of Norman MacLean said, like, crank the faucet down and let the words come out drop by drop. And Harrison was like, turn the freaking thing on blast, right? And catch it in every cup that you can. So, I mean, to have that kind of generosity of spirit and mentorship, I think he would hate that word, but to have that kind of guidance and friendship from someone who I grew up reading was mind-boggling and incredibly formative to me. And he was so generous with our family, and he was a total champion of my work. I mean, one of the last interviews he gave was the By the Book interview in the New York Times, where he actually mentioned Body of Water, like,
I remember that.
Yeah, like a week before it came out or something like that. And it was, I mean,
could you believe that? I mean, like, seriously, could you believe that?
No, I still can't believe it. How do you begin to fathom that gift? But then here's the thing. If I'd never known him, if I'd never met him, never eaten with him, fished with him, drank with him, walked with him, I would still have his work, which is, an incredible record of a full-hearted, full-throated existence on Earth. And that in itself, like, a huge inspiration, that answers your question, I think.
I love it. There's one other question I have. There's a quote in there that he mentions to you at some point. Y'all are out somewhere and he says, "Don't let your life become the sloppy leftovers of your work."
Right.
What does that mean to you?
Yeah. Well, that scene there, he's talking about, he and his daughter were in an argument. She was upset with him because, he was getting older, and she was saying, like, you never took me fishing, even though you fished 100+ days a year. And he said, I took you fishing. And she said, twice. And I remember, like, those words hitting me harder than any line he'd ever written. And I probably have more Harrison lines memorized than I do my own lines, but he was taking that moment to be instructive to me, to say, like, he says, do you know what that dilapidated cabin essentially, like, says to a young writer such as yourself? And I said, no, what does it mean? And he said, don't let your life become the sloppy leftovers of your work, And it was at that point, that was actually a very liberating moment in our relationship, because I probably held him up on a pedestal. And at that point I was like, okay, the mistakes, what he's calling mistakes, the mistakes that he made in his life can be more instructive to me, perhaps as a person, than even his writing. Right. And so, later in the book, when we're in Michigan and I'm visiting the old French Road farm, there's a moment where I come to terms with the fact that there were probably things worth imitating in Jim's life, and then there were plenty to disregard, right?
Yeah, and I think David Gessner, the author, he writes a lot about that. He wrote a book about Theodore Roosevelt that came out in August 2020, at the height of when everybody is rightfully reevaluating a lot of these rich white dudes from the 1800s. And he speaks about that, about biography. And the point is to take the good stuff and look at it all very clearly, good and bad. And you take the good stuff and discard the bad stuff. And he talks about using biography, to make yourself a better person, and that he goes to biographies because he's looking for something. And I feel like, in my experience, whether it's Theodore Roosevelt or Jim Harrison or anybody, knowing the full story, both the good and the bad, it makes it the whole experience of understanding them and their work much richer. It's boring if you're getting the superhero version of these people and just the good. And that's simply not true. And it's misleading. Mm-hmm. And I feel like being able to look at a guy like Harrison and he's got tons of flaws, just like me. And this is what he did great, and this is what he didn't do great. In some ways, you can learn more from what he didn't do great. And so I loved the way you wrote about him. And I've emailed you before, like, I need Jim Harrison recommendations because I haven't read enough of his stuff, even close to what I should. So this is more motivation to dig into his work.
Wow, that's great. I love that.
There's one passage that I loved about parenting, and rather than hear me read it, which would probably infuriate you, like, you guys ruining my words. Could you read, it's the one on page 216, as a rower. Could you read that section? Because I love it.
Yeah. As a rower, I long ago realized that muscle and oar can only resist so much, that physical exertion is often inferior to ceding to the always stronger water, then assessing a new current line and adjusting one's approach from there. Strangely, life has seemed simpler, albeit not financially or logistically or emotionally, since I resigned myself to the complexity of our current navigational equation. It's not that all my angst floated off downstream, just that I have far less time to tend it. Now and then, I'll get to worrying about our ecological footprint and the gas our allegedly fuel-fit minivan guzzles or doesn't, but I'm reluctant to succumb to the opiate of collective guilt. To raise a child mindfully is itself an act of radical activism. Che Guevara, the true revolutionary, is guided by a great feeling of love. The mindful parent knows that adding a child to the earth's ledger is consequential, that this act adds challenge, pressure, and acknowledged complicity to the everyday, sometimes driving the stakes straight through our faltering ozone. It's a daily self-subpoena of sorts to raise children with a mind on the earth's health as well, and some days an accompanying ennui is enough to fold me. But a conversation I had the other day with Molly led me to believe we might be okay, come what may. We'd been out picking watercress for a pesto recipe when she asked why we went to the outdoors to find food. I thought about it for a while, then finally ventured, because the earth is good to us. Yeah, Molly agreed. She's our godmother.
I love that passage. I mean, if you saw the book, I've got stuff underlined on basically every page through it. But I thought that was so great because I had those same thoughts about, I've got a 7 and a 4-year-old, and it's like when you see, everything from the population projections here in Colorado, and I know how much water we have, and there's not enough water to support those number of people, to just long-term sustainability things. And it's just like, oh man, should I be bringing kids into this world? It's just, I feel like your book, again, it looks at it all clearly, but it gives hope. Mm-hmm. I mean, do you feel, so like a lot of this book is written when your children were younger. Now, I mean, you got one getting ready to go off to college, which is crazy. What's your thinking on kids? You got an adult now. I mean, he might not be legally an adult yet, but he's a man.
Yeah, he's 18. Yeah.
So he's a man. So like, have your thoughts changed at all on just kind of where we stand with the environment, and having kids and all that?
I mean, if Mary and I have no kids, zero, I'm just thinking this out, and we do our best to be stewards of the land and, activists for environmental causes throughout our life. Like, we make an impact, but that dies out, right?
Yep.
But if we have 3 kids, and two of them fall in love with the natural world and become stewards and activists, and then eventually have children of their own, perhaps. I mean, I get the statistics or whatever, how many babies are being born each day. It's in relation to how many people are dying. I see that, but it just doesn't make sense to me to not give it a crack, right? So I guess my thought is like, okay, I really believe, what Che says in that moment, like, and I think if we're not bringing humans into the world that will someday be hell bent on protecting it, then we're just as hopeless as we were before. I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, in addition, I mean, in my case, and in as is the case with this narrative, our children end up guiding me to a deeper awareness of my existence on the earth, and in turn render me more apt to protect it, right?
That's a really good point that I had not thought about. But I completely agree with it.
I don't know that I'd thought about it until this moment either,
No, seriously, because that's how it was for me. I mean, like that. I mean, I was 37 when or maybe 38 when my first kid was born. And it was, I mean, you hear all these cliches about your life changes and all that kind of stuff. And it's not like a clap of, or at least for me, it wasn't a clap of thunder and everything changes, but I was kind of in a process of changing, and that sealed the deal. And I mean, I didn't start this podcast. I didn't start my book recommendations until after my first girl was born. And then I started the podcast maybe when she was like six months old. No, like 9 months old. And so like, I feel like in a lot of ways for me, children made me at one point in one way took the blinders off, and another way put blinders on, that I just got unbelievably focused. Mm-hmm. And that's when I went into conservation. I mean, soon after that. So I'd never thought about that, but I think that's a really good point. Mm-hmm. One other thing, we were just speaking about your wife there a second ago, Mary, and she plays such a prominent role in this book and just seems so awesome. I've not met her, but I want to. And like I think we share in common that we both, as my dad said, married up. My dad said that Kim improved the Robertson family gene pool when I met her. and so there's one part in there that I loved before your first kid was born, and you were worried that you weren't going to be able to be right. You weren't going to be able to write as much when you were a father. And she said, if you stop writing altogether, I guess I would say that it's just not important enough to you.
Yeah, it just didn't mean enough to you, she said.
Yeah, it just didn't mean enough to you. And so can you talk about that scene? Because I love that.
Yeah, I love that scene because, as you see throughout the book, I mean, she's just one of the most tender, luminous human beings alive. But she can also be so blunt, right? And so can deliver such a hard blow like that. A truth, though. It's a truth, right? And yeah, I remember that moment as if it were yesterday, driving up the Blackfoot together and having that conversation and thinking like, when someone tells you something that you need to hear, but it's painful.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
And when that advice comes from the person that you love and trust more than anyone in the world, it's all the more damning.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, she's just remarkable.
When you're when you're teaching, because you teach at the university there, I feel like that, like a guy like you've studied it, you've got education in writing and all that kind of stuff. But even if you didn't, you'd be writing because it's just what you're supposed to do. And it's continued through your life, through all, ups, downs, whatever, you've continued to write. And pretty much every single writer I've had on this podcast is the same way. Mm-hmm. So like when you're talking to these students that you're instructing on, everything there is to know about how you structure a short story or how you write a book and all the technical stuff. But at the end of the day, if they don't have that just kind of primal desire to write, it probably doesn't matter because like they get busy, they're not going to write.
Right.
And for you, but then there's a type of writer like you who can go to grad school and learn a lot, and it helps you hone your craft, but you're going to be writing regardless. So like, do you ever give kids advice on that? I mean, have you ever told somebody like, look, you don't care about this enough. You know, there's nothing I can teach. It's like when I went to business school, I don't want to do spreadsheets. Like, you know, I mean, I know how to do them, and I thought maybe business school would make me want to do it more, but it never did. It never did. You know, I mean, I can do a spreadsheet like a champ. That doesn't mean it's what I'm supposed to be doing.
Right.
So how do you approach that as a teacher and a mentor?
Right. I mean, I think the one piece of advice I give people, because it doesn't necessarily call them out personally, but it does point to that same reality, is if you don't have to write, don't.
Yeah.
You know, like if your survival doesn't depend on it, then don't bother. But if it does, you know, then construct your life in such a way as to give that impulse full vent, right? I mean, because if your survival does depend on it, you won't be whole without it. You know, speaking of Harrison, he has a lot of great fictional characters that were failed artists. And by failed, I don't mean that they didn't sell work. I mean that they rejected the call, right? They were called to be an artist. They knew that, and then they stopped for one reason or another, you know, and these are like some of his beautifully troubled characters, right? And so, you know, you have to curate a life that allows you to give time to that impulse, and to that need, to that necessity, right? And then the more you do, the more vectors is the word that I think of. And I haven't taken a physics class since Vance Hamilton in my junior year of high school at East Lansing High School. But vectors are the word that come to mind when I think of writing. Like, so many things that we start and abandon come back to us in other ways. Like, they have energies. They want, like, a story wants to be told, right? We give it a few paragraphs, a few lines, a stanza or two in a poem, and then it dies, it fizzles out. But then 10 years later, like, an event occurs and it triggers like a similar emotion, and suddenly, like, an image that was conjured on a page 10 years before is finding a place on the page now. And that's remarkable. And that's why you have to write a lot out of the gate. Yeah. You know, you have to write a lot out of the gate, because a lot of what you're going to write is going to be thrown away, except those vectors are going to exist. And they're going to reappear further on down the line. Taj Mahal would say, "You will accompany me," right? These stories are going to come back in some way, shape, or form. And always loved. Stop me if I said this before, but you know, I'm not a huge Hemingway fan anymore. I still love like the Nick Adams stories, and The Sun Also Rises is a favorite of mine. But you know, a lot of what he said in interviews and whatnot was just you know, just so cloaked in machismo, and that it's hard to swallow. But he says something like, most of writing is going to the work every day and finishing what you started. And for a long time, I thought to myself, like, finishing what you started meant, okay, I started this short story 6 months ago, I better go back and try to finish it. Of course, that's part of it. But also, I think beginning something sometimes means, what did you begin in vision, right? Like, the vision of a life as a writer is something that is elusive, but you have to keep going back to it the same way you would try to finish a short story, right? Or even a piece of work that you began in the form of notes. You know, in my case, like, a lot of this book was written from my journals that I kept over the course of 15 or so years. And so, like, I guess finishing what you started often has a practical meaning, but all other times a more visionary meaning.
That makes sense to me. And I just think at the base, because I've been on the far other end of this, you just have to be kind of obsessed and really love what you're doing. And I don't mean love it like it's fun all the time. I mean, you got to just be obsessed and feel a need to do it, because I think about that with my podcast. I'm not trying to compare me asking people questions to you writing these beautiful books. But like, I'll stay up till 2 a.m. working on this thing. And I one time I thought, like, if my boss, like if somebody at one of my jobs had told me to stay up till 2 a.m. doing work, I'd be like, well, I quit. I mean, you can't tell me what to do. But then I don't want to be up at 2 a.m, but I have to be up at till 2 a.m. And I think that's kind of a good test now that I've seen, like, I'm turning into an old man, like, are you willing to, and some people do that. Like I was talking to my buddy the other day, he does real estate stuff, investments, and he loves it. And he'll stay up till 2 a.m. working on these things because he loves it. And so I think it kind of finds you, and it's lucky and it's a privileged place to be in a position where I can even say something like that instead of like working on a paving crew on the interstate. But I think if you are in a privileged place to be like that, it's kind of a good sign. Like, are you willing to just drive yourself into the ground for this kind of stuff? Yeah. Again, very privileged place to even talk about nonsense like that, but it's true. One other thing about the book, I told you before we started recording, I had to drive like 6-7 hours yesterday. And so I was listening to the audio version, which I generally don't listen to audiobooks, and I loved it. Can you talk about the narrator?
Sure. Yeah. That's my dear friend, Jeffrey Foucault, who's just a dynamite musician, songwriter, guitar player, lives in Western Mass, but was raised in Wisconsin, and loves the West. We spend a lot of time together out here fishing, hunting, but he's also my first editor. He probably sees my poems and my prose before anyone else does. And same with his music. I've heard the roughs to basically every song he's put out on his last 7 or 8 albums. And we're dear best friends and probably each other's most severe critic. So we have a wonderful relationship in that sense. And I don't know exactly how this came to be, but he might have been listening to an audiobook and said, "Who's going to read your audiobook?" And I said, I have no idea. And his agent got in touch with Milkweed, my publisher, and they said, "Man, Jeffrey would be perfect for this. He knows the work well, and he has a beautiful voice." And then he composed these gorgeous, like, interludes between the chapters and on guitar. And so it was. I've been calling it the pearl buttons on the snap shirt. At the end of this amazing process of getting to put a book into the world with a killer publisher like Milkweed. The design work that Mary Austin Speaker does on the cover, and the editing that I'm blessed to have with Daniel, my editor. At the end of all that, then I get this beautiful audiobook, which is like the snap shirt button. So speaking of Tacovas, hey, send me some free shirts, Tacovas.
Yeah, they sent me some, and they're really awesome. Those Tacova shirts, they're really nice. Yes, by the way,
that's awesome. I need some more mediums, snap shirts, Tacovas. If you're listening,
we'll make that happen. They need to do that. They would be missing a big opportunity if they don't do that. And they just got free advertising.
That's right.
All right, last question for you. First of all, everybody needs to immediately purchase The River You Touch. Read that, and then I want to hear what other books you've been reading recently. Anything surprising, anything caught your attention? And also the Mountain Prairie listeners need to understand that so many of the guests that I've had on here that have I've had these awesome interviews with and struck up friendships with are because of your kind introductions. Like I'm thinking about Nick Butler, for example. I mean, you introduced me to him, and what a awesome dude, what a talented artist. There's a long list. I mean, Adam Gall, my first elk I ever got to shoot was because of your kind intro. So thank you for that. But give me some book recs.
Yes. Okay. Well, I've been dipping back into this Brian Doyle book, One Long River of Song.
My friend Brendan sent me that, who lives in Missoula. And if you haven't hung out with him, you need to, but I've got it on my desk and I haven't read it.
Oh, it's just, I mean, I read it in galleys a couple of years ago and then I put it away and picked it up the other day. And it's just absolutely just mind blowing how good he was. And he actually published a couple of essays that appear in modified form in this new book, In the River You Touch. And so he was very kind to them, to my work. And so I've been reading that, One Long River of Song. I've been reading Believers, Making a Life at the End of the World by Lisa Wells, a wonderful writer from Seattle. Also a poet, nonfiction crossover person. I've been rereading Perma Red by Deborah Magpie Erling, and alongside her new forthcoming novel, The Lost Journals of Sacagawea, which it's a one-of-a-kind reading experience. It reminds me, the only book that I've encountered that's as immersive as this book is James Welch's Fool's Crow, which is one of my favorite novels ever. And what else have I been reading? Oh, I've been back reading my buddy Taylor Burby's Boys in Oil that I mentioned earlier. So that's student work too, which I always love and am inspired by. So that's pretty much it. It's starting to slink into poetry reading season. The winter seems to bring that out in me, but not yet.
Well, man, this was awesome, and I could keep asking you questions, but I'll do that at another time, because I know you have other stuff to do besides listen to me drill you with questions. But I can't tell you how much my life has been enriched by our friendship, and it's just the power of the internet. It's the good side of the internet, and for all my blabbing about the internet, like I owe it a lot for friendships like this. And so just keep up the great work, man. It makes the world better. Selfishly, it makes my life better, and I really appreciate everything you do.
Oh my God. Ed, thank you. This is, like the highlight of my fall to get to talk to you. So thank you so much. Thanks for your attention to the book, and thanks to all your wonderful listeners out there. I mean, it's a great community, and the West needs more of you. So thank you.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend